Alright, so now let's go back inside the greenhouse here, and I'm going to give you 5 really good tips on how to get these tricky seeds to germinate. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having a wonderful day. It is Monday, March 11th here in South Georgia, and today we're going to do a little bit of what I like to call high-level seed starting. Going to get these watermelons going in the greenhouse behind me. Going to tell you all the tips and tricks you need to know to get seedless watermelons germinated. So in our last video, I told you about our slow yet effective chicken till technique that we're using to get one of our 30 by 35 plots ready to plant watermelons. Today we're going to get our seeds started, but first let's check on how some of our other transplants are doing. So here's what we've got going so far, just tomatoes and peppers. I'll explain in a minute why we have a dome on that tray, even though there's nothing planted there. But anyways, this green tray here was the one we started first. Got several different varieties of tomatoes in there, and we had a few of these get leggy on us, so we had to step them up to these larger 2.5 inch pots. They're loving it in those pots. These are actually outgrowing these that were planted at the same time. I think it has to do with the fact there's more soil in there. Probably can hold more of the fertilizer we've been feeding them every day. It's just a guess, but I think that's why. Anyways, these right here will get planted straight out of this tray, and it won't be long before they'll be ready. These right here probably will be ready pretty soon too. Then we planted this second tray here, peppers and some more tomatoes. Our peppers came up really well. Need to thin a few of those cells there. This little lane on the end was some older King Arthur seeds I had. They didn't germinate that great, but I only need a couple plants anyway, so I don't think I'll replant those. Anyways, those are on their way to looking really, really good, and if I can, I'll try to plant directly out of this tray as well. Skip the whole stepping up process if I can. And while we're looking at these, I figured I'd show you what we've got going on root ball wise. It tells me these aren't quite ready to go in the ground, so I took one of those rose transplants there, pushed it up from the bottom, laid it right here on the heat mat. You can see we're starting to get a decent root ball, but it's not holding together really well, so that tells me probably got another week or so on these. I could put that in the ground, but I want that root ball to be a little more established. I want that ball of soil there sticking together a little better than it is now. But back outside, let's talk about the task at hand today, which is getting some of these seedless and seeded watermelon seeds going in one of those trays. So as I mentioned earlier, germinating seedless watermelon seeds is what I like to call high-level seed starting. I wouldn't recommend trying this if you've never done seed starting before. But if you've got the hang of growing your own tomato plants, pepper plants, you know, cool season veggies like broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, if you've got that down pretty well, then you might want to try germinating some seedless watermelon seeds. I think it's a fun challenge for any gardener to try. Yes, there are a lot of differences between germinating these and germinating those tomatoes in there, for example, but I'm here to help. I'm going to walk you through the process. Now, anytime we're talking about seedless watermelons, we always get the obvious question, if it was a seedless watermelon, then where did the seeds come from? And on this video, I'm not going to get into a lot of the minutia, the science behind it. We've covered that on a bunch of other videos in the past, but just briefly, I'll explain how this works. We've got these seedless watermelon seeds. These have 4 sets of chromosomes. We've got our seeded seeds. These have 2 sets of chromosomes. When we plant these together in the same plot and they cross-pollinate, we get individuals with 3 sets of chromosomes that are sterile and therefore seedless. So growing out seeded watermelon transplants is pretty easy. We do that the same way we do tomatoes, peppers, pretty much anything else we grow from transplants in the greenhouse. But seedless watermelons are a good bit different. They're tricky. There's a lot of special things you got to do with these that you don't have to do with these. And if you've never done this before, just know that these seedless seeds are pretty pricey, so I would get the hang of it before I went all in and bought a bunch of seedless seeds. Maybe just buy a pack of 10 seeds, get the hang of it a year or two, and then you can kind of increase the amount of seedless transplants you're growing. It took me several years to get the hang of it, but I've done pretty well with it the last couple of years, and I'm going to share my tricks with you today. But before we get into that, let's talk about the varieties we're going to be planting today. So last year I grew a red seedless and a yellow seedless. The year before that I grew an orange seedless. For whatever reason, my middle child Titus really likes the orange seedless watermelons. My oldest child Abram really likes the yellow seedless watermelon. So I have to alternate every other year, growing orange, and then the other years growing a yellow seedless ones, just to keep everybody happy. They're all good to me, but for some reason they have their own color preferences. So because we grew yellow last year, we're doing orange this year. This is a variety I grew 2 years ago called Orange Crisp. Really good tasting orange seedless watermelon, so I'm excited to try that one again. And then the red seedless we're growing this year is one we grew last year called Cracker Jack. Big fan of this variety here. We did some bricks tests with those watermelons last year, and the sweetness level of them was off the charts. It was at the higher end of what's possible with a watermelon, so had to go Cracker Jack again. And then we've got our seeded watermelon that we have to have. This year we're using a variety called Sangria. So when you're growing seedless watermelons, you have to plant a seeded variety in the same plot, in the same area. Got to have those male flowers from the seeded variety to pollinate the female flowers on these seedless varieties. And when you purchase seedless watermelon seeds, most companies are going to give you some extra seeds to serve as the pollinator. The pollinator could be any seeded variety out there. It doesn't have to be a specific variety. Any standard seeded watermelon will work as a pollinator. So Johnny's likes to include this variety called Ace as a pollinator. So since I bought 2 packets of seedless seeds from them, I also got 2 packets of Ace, but Ace is not really a good watermelon to eat, so I always like to use my own pollinator, and that's why we chose Sangria, which is supposed to be a really good tasting seeded watermelon. Now for the life of me, I can't remember what seeded variety I used as my pollinator last year. It worked good. It was a good tasting watermelon. Just can't remember the name of it. But I remember that I made the mistake of picking a pollinator that looked a lot like the seedless varieties. And we had some fun on several of the videos opening up the watermelons. We didn't know whether it was going to be seedless or seeded. So it's a good idea, whatever you decide you want your pollinator to be, make sure it's a different shape or a different color than these seedless ones here. Otherwise, it's hard to tell when you're out there picking watermelons whether you're picking a seedless one or a seeded one. This Sangria watermelon here has more of an elongated shape, whereas these seedless ones here are more round. So hopefully this year I'll be able to easily distinguish between seedless and seeded. And then the last thing you need to know before buying seedless watermelon seeds is that you're going to need 3 times as many seedless transplants than you have seeded transplants. So when we put these in the ground, we plant them at a 3-to-1 ratio. Along the row there, we put 3 seedless transplants, then 1 seeded transplant, then 3 of these, then 1 of these. We can put more of these seeded transplants in the ground. That's not going to hurt anything, but we at least want to maintain that 3-to-1 ratio because we need to have enough male flowers out there to pollinate these seedless plants. So when purchasing your seeds, especially if you're not going to use the pollinator variety that the seed retailer provides, just make sure you've got enough seeded seeds or transplants that grow out to fulfill that 3-to-1 ratio. Alright, so now let's go back inside the greenhouse here, and I'm going to give you 5 really good tips on how to get these tricky seeds to germinate. So tip number 1 is to nick or cut the rounded end of the seedless watermelon seed. Let me show you what I mean. So here we have 2 seed packets. We've got our seedless Cracker Jack seed, and we've got our seeded Sangria seed. I pulled out a seed from each packet here so we can look at the differences. That Sangria seed, the blue one there, those are treated. So this is not blue watermelons, it's just a treated seed. The other seed there is the Cracker Jack, and you can see how I've cut the rounded end off of there. So I just took my knife and just nicked the tip, the rounded end there of that seed. So I used a knife. You could also use fingernail clippers. The main thing to know is get the rounded end, don't get the pointy end of the seed. These seedless seeds are pretty thick, and so nicking the rounded end of them helps them start to absorb water or moisture a little faster, seems to speed up the germination process, and I've gotten a much more consistent germination rate since I started doing that a couple years ago. Now, if you're planting a whole field of seedless watermelons like the commercial guys around here do, probably not real practical to do this with several pounds of seed. But when we're just dealing with 50 seeds like we are here, it didn't take me but a few minutes to cut the rounded end off those. And just as a side note, those giant pumpkin, giant watermelon, and giant butternut squash seeds we have on our website, not a bad idea to nick the rounded end of those seeds as well. You'll get them to germinate a lot faster that way. And now for tip number 2, which is preheat your seed starting mix or whatever soil you're using. You don't want to plant these seedless seeds in cold soil. So I came out here yesterday, filled this orange tray, which looks just like this blue tray here, filled it with Pro Mix, went ahead and moistened it down, put that dome over it. It's on that heat mat, which is running wide open, so our soil is already nice and warm for us. So this does take a little bit of planning in advance. We need to know a day ahead of time before we're going to plant these seedless seeds, so we can go ahead and moisten our seed starting mix, get it on a heat mat, get it nice and warmed up for us. Now let's plant these seeds, and we'll talk about tips 3, 4, and 5. So we're going to take off this dome here. Going to dump that water back on the tray there. Set this to the side for right now. Got my labels here. Try to plant relatively equal amounts of each. I can always share some of these extra seeded transplants that I have. So something like that right there should be good. We've already got indentions made in our soil. We did that yesterday. So all we got to do is start dropping some seeds in there. So we'll start out with a Cracker Jack, work our way through the tray, putting one seed in each cell. So now that our seeds are down, we just need to cover them. So to do that, I'm going to put it in this bottom tray here. And we've got some good old Go Dogs perlite. You could also use vermiculite for this. Perlite or vermiculite is a good idea. It's going to keep those seeds from getting too wet and too moist in there. Just going to lightly cover these with our perlite. And now that those are covered with perlite, we can talk about tip 3. So tip number 3 is to wrap or cover the tray. We don't need to water these seeds. There's enough moisture in that Pro Mix there for these seeds to germinate. We don't need to water them over the top like we would tomato or pepper seeds. Now in the past, I have used Saran wrap over the tray. That works really, really well. The only kicker to that is you need to be around, because as soon as they start popping underneath that Saran wrap, you got to cut it off so those plants can breathe a little bit. The boys are out of school on Friday. I think we're going to slide off on a little camping trip, so I might not be around to take off the Saran wrap. So instead of using Saran wrap this year, I'm just going to use the humidity dome in the greenhouse. But give Saran wrap a try if you're around. Just keep a close eye on them, because even in a greenhouse, they can start suffering if you don't take that wrap off in time. So we're going to roll with humidity dome this year. I'm pretty confident this will work. May not work quite as well as the Saran wrap, but time will tell. And then tip number 4, which we're already doing here, you're gonna need a heat mat. You need to keep that soil as consistently warm as possible. It's probably actually easier to do this indoors than it is out here in the greenhouse this time of year, because we get nighttime temperatures. It cools off a little bit, then it warms up during the day. But the heat mat helps us out a good bit, trying to keep that soil consistently warm. Now in previous years, I have used a thermostat with my heat mat, and that can keep you from getting things too hot. But for some reason, that thermostat was wanting to trip my outlet really bad all the time. So haven't used a thermostat this year. Haven't gotten things too hot. You can see most of our seeds germinated pretty well. And even when I was using that thermostat, it would get on up there 100, 105 degrees, and it didn't seem to bother these seedless watermelons. So I would say crank it up, get it nice and warm for them. And then our final tip, tip number 5, is to go real easy on the water. I told you earlier, there's enough water in that tray underneath that dome for those seeds to germinate. We don't need to water them until they germinate. But even after they germinate, we need to be really, really careful with the water. You can easily overwater these things and kill them. They're a little frail and fragile in the beginning, but they eventually will take off. So we don't want to water these near as much as we do tomato and pepper seedlings. You know, err on the side of the soil being a little dry. Don't soak it down every single day. And if you do those 5 things, you should be somewhat successful growing your own seedless watermelon transplants. You're probably not going to knock it out of the park the first year. And here's what I would recommend doing. If you're already growing a plot of seeded watermelons, maybe just get you a small pack of seedless watermelons, 10 seeds or so, and just try to get some of them to germinate, and then you can kind of plant them amongst all your seeded ones. Like I told you earlier, it's not going to hurt to have more seeded transplants than it is seedless transplants. So start small, get the hang of it, and then you can kind of graduate to doing that 3-to-1 ratio that we talked about before. So I hope you enjoyed the video today. I hope most of you out there are growing some watermelons this year, because remember, watermelons are the ultimate survival food. And if you want to know where we got those trays, I'll put a link in the description below. You can find those garden labels on our website at lazydogfarm.com. And if you want to see some of those Cracker Jack watermelons from last year when we did a bricks test on those and saw just how sweet they are, watch this video right here, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.